Good evening and welcome to the Basic Science Lights the Way series. I'm excited to be joining you tonight in my new role as the Dean of Biological Sciences. So you may be wondering who am I, except for Terry Mackin. I've been a faculty member in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology since 1984. And in that time, I've not only done research, but I've taken roles as chair, division head, and most recently, I've had the pleasure of serving as a senior associate dean under Mike Botchin's deanship. My research aims to understand the early developmental biology of vertebrate animals, really concentrating at the molecular level. And we look at the early embryo and the first steps in the formation of the head and the tail, the nervous system and such. Mostly we look at frogs, which, as you may know, also produce and listen to sounds. But that's not what we'll hear about today. We'll hear about other animals, including people. One of the things that attracted me initially to this line of research was just watching embryos and seeing how they cleave and how they change their shape. And maybe one day they'll let me give you a presentation and show you some movies. Anyway, you can always ask me, send me an email and ask for links to movies. Now, that's enough about me. Tonight, we're going to hear from faculty members working in the physical and biological sciences about the intricate relationship between neuroscience, physics, and music. They'll address such questions as, does sound have a shape? How does sound become meaningful for biological organisms? Can music be reconstructed through brainwave recordings? I don't need to tell you that music engages multiple systems and responses in our bodies, enhancing mood and fostering emotional awareness and connection. This interplay highlights how music not only reflects the complexities of human biology, but also serves as a vital tool. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, Francis Hellman, who is the professor of the graduate school and in the Department of Physics, and also former Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. So over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Richard. And I am very happy to be moderating this evening. In addition to being a physicist, I'm also a musician and with a family band, which is, so I am an ardent amateur musician. So I'm very excited to hear this talk also. Some of you may remember me in my previous role as dean in previous events when we launched this series 4 years ago. It is truly awesome to see how much it has grown since then. If you attended Homecoming earlier this month, you may have seen our first ever live Basic Science Lights the Way event, where faculty discussed how global warming alters our world, from the changing environments of many ecosystems to the effects of a rising heat index and increasingly extreme weather phenomena. If you missed it or you would like to rewatch the talk, the recording will be available on the Basic Sciences website in the coming weeks. Tonight's topic is personal to me, somebody who's both a musician and a physicist. At its core, music is fundamentally a series of sound waves governed by the principles of physics. The pitch that we hear is determined by the frequency of these waves, while the rich timbre of an instrument or voice arises from its harmonics and overtones, which demonstrates the complex interplay of wave behavior with both the instrument that produces it and our ears in hearing it. Concepts like the resonance of the instrument explains why a violin sounds different from a flute, even when they play the same note. And acoustics reveal how sound interacts with environments, shaping our listening experiences. The mathematical relationships inherent in musical scales, such as the simple ratios that define intervals, highlight a universal language that is simultaneously unique to different cultures, yet transcends culture. And each of our speakers tonight use music as a foundational tool in their research. So at the end of each talk, we're going to have 3 talks, and at the end of each talk, we will try to address questions from the audience. So please add questions into the chat. Our first speaker this evening is Terry Buehler, who is a longtime and very much valued lecturer in the Department of Physics. Terry Buehler first co-lectured the already popular undergraduate course, Physics and Music, in 2012, and has then taught it every year since. Physics and Music is a course designed to help students think about how to approach the world with the eyes, ears, and mind of a scientist using the physical principles encountered in the study of music. Terry has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and mathematics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a graduate degree in mathematics from UC Berkeley. He's been in the physics department since 2000, lecturing introductory physics in addition to his physics and music class that he's going to tell us about tonight. And he also manages the lower division instructional labs. So Terry, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And can you share with us some of the interesting facts about music and sound that you cover in your course?
Thank you for that introduction, Francis. Thank you also for allowing me to speak. I do teach the physics of music class. It's a discovery class. We cover a wide range of topics. Tonight, we'll try to give you a little insight of what we try to get students who maybe don't have a physics background or other science background to understand how we analyze sounds and how that can be interpreted in terms of what we hear and perceive in terms of musical instruments. So to start, any instrument producing a sound, we have to get it to resonate at a particular frequency, vibrations in the air on a flute or on a string and a vibrating string on a violin. Those are passed through a traveling wave, reaches, for example, a microphone on your computer or maybe an eardrum, and that produces a signal, and we want to be able to analyze that signal. If the wave in the instrument is more complex, you could have more harmonics vibrating. That produces a more complex wave, which is then translated to, again, the microphone, and it produces a more complex signal here that we would like to address. So the simplest of the tones would be, for example, a whistle or tuning fork, a single frequency. This is the waveform, how the pressure might vary. This is the frequency spectrum, shows a single frequency. Down here is very similar. It's called a frequency spectrogram, just shows the same frequency for a time. If we have, sorry, double click, a more complicated instrument like a trumpet, any of the brass instruments, woodwinds, strings in our orchestra are complex harmonic instruments. So the timbre is made up of a collection of frequencies which happen to be integer multiples of the fundamental, or as Francis said, the pitch that we hear. Once we have that understanding of the spectrum for instruments, we can then study different instruments. And so even if the instruments are playing the same note, they have different timbres, and that's reflected in the frequency spectrum. The last one was the campanile bell, which I added, which isn't a harmonic instrument, but that too can be seen in the spectrogram. It's not made up of nice integer multiples. Take, for example, the trombone. You see nice intervals here. The campanile bell has many overtones, which are not integer multiples. So once we have that understanding, how does that translate into what we hear? And can we use anything to understand how we perceive sounds and notes together? So for that, we need to understand a little bit about how the ear is structured. The sound comes in and vibrates the eardrum, which is passed through the ossicles and sends vibrations into the cochlea, which is the spiral portion of the inner ear. We usually envision the cochlea as unwound or unrolled, and inside that is a basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane is basically a frequency spectrum analyzer. Different frequencies excite different portions of the basilar membrane. Low frequencies far away from the start of the cochlea, high frequencies closer to it, closer to the oval window. I have an animation that shows this. So here we have the cochlea, it's rolled up. We unroll it. This is the basilar membrane. Take note of the tapered shape to it. So this tapered shape helps us understand why the membrane responds differently to different frequencies. The narrow portion responds to high frequencies, much like the short strings on a piano or the high-pitched notes. The wide portion responds naturally to low frequencies, much like the long strings on a piano or a harp. So if a sound has multiple frequencies, you can excite multiple regions at once. So let's take a little look at how a frequency excites a region on the basilar membrane. If you play a pure tone, a single frequency, you still excite a small range of the basilar membrane. So you excite the frequency and its neighbors. So that's indicated by this. So what happens if we have two frequencies? Well, it depends on where they fall on the basilar membrane. If they're very close together, they might look like this. If they're very far apart, and then what happens if they overlap? I'll play a series of tones. Here the two frequencies were identical. There they were separated by 5 hertz and began to hear a beating. There the beating was much faster. But as the frequencies begin to separate, suddenly it sounds okay. This is a graph of polling people and sweeping through all the different differences in frequencies and asking them to rate the consonants. As you begin to separate the frequencies, you hear beats. Eventually the beats are too fast for us to hear, and so it just sounds rough. But as the frequencies get far enough apart, you begin to hear two tones. So then the question is, what about a piano? Long before we had frequency spectra and computers, people built instruments and they knew that certain notes sounded good together, certain notes didn't sound good together. And so in the interest of time, I won't go through all the combinations of notes, but if I did, and we polled people, we'd end up with a graph like this, where the high points are notes that sound good together. So hopefully you can sort of agree that maybe this sounded good, but when we got up to here, the frequencies are farther apart. The notes on the keyboard seem farther apart, but it sounded worse, more dissonant. We might have expected a graph like this. It's similar to the previous graph, where the farther apart the frequencies get, the better it sounds. So then the question is, how do we explain this outlier, or for that matter, any of these other pairs? Well, we can understand that by looking at the frequency spectra. Here I'm looking at the last two examples here. Here were the two notes that sounded good together. Individually, each is a complex harmonic, so it excites multiple regions on the basilar membrane. By itself, each note is okay. When you combine them, you excite all the possible frequencies that are present. Some of them are separate. Some of them, like right here, hopefully you see my cursor, fall exactly in the same place. If they were exactly in the same place, that's okay. If they are widely separated, that sounded okay. Here were the two notes that sounded dissonant. So again, individually, each excites several different frequencies, but the frequencies are separated on the basal membrane. That's okay. This is okay. It's when you combine them, and I'll zoom in on the last graph, where suddenly you have to worry not just about how the fundamental frequencies or the notes that are being played might compare, but you also have to worry about the overtones. Here, the second harmonic of the C is overlapping with the first harmonic of the B on the piano keyboard, and that's what gives us this dissonance. So hopefully at this point, students in my class have begun to get a feel for how we can use the spectra to understand how the ear works and how we can perceive notes that sound good or bad together. This is really where I tell my students physics sort of stops, or at least physics for my class stops. The next step in this process is all the regions on the basal membrane have to excite nerves and send signals to the brain, and that's where psychology and neuroscience take over. Fortunately, we have a couple of speakers who will be able to speak with more expertise on those topics. But for my part of the talk, I thank you, and I guess we'll turn it back over to Francis for questions.
So thank you, Terry. So I'm going to start with one of the questions from the audience, which is, what is the frequency range that humans can hear?
That changes. It varies from person to person. The generic range that we use is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. But as you get older, that high end falls off. The basal membrane becomes a little bit stiffer and less responsive to higher frequencies. I'm told that children get ringtones that are very high frequencies, so when they get calls at 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, they can hear their phone ringing, but their parents can't.
All you parents out there, pay attention to that comment. So I have an interesting question here on the topic of, how does culture help to shape which combinations of notes sound good and which don't sound good?
That's actually very interesting. It has a lot to do with the instruments that they play. In Western music, we use harmonic instruments, the brass, the woodwinds, the strings. If you go to, for example, the Pacific Islands, they use gongs, an instrument called gender. And when you look at the overtones for those, they are not harmonic. A drum, a gong, the campanile bell will have all these overtones which are different. So if you have two frequencies for Western music, harmonics, an octave is a multiple of 2 for the frequencies. But for a gender, you might want two frequencies which are, say, 100 and 180, because one of the overtones matches up with that 180. So you build instruments, and again, this was all done before computers, so you built it by how it sounds, but you build instruments and listen for that dissonance, and really what you're listening for is where the overtones are matching up and all. It won't be quite the same as a harmonic instrument, but that's a whole nother area of the class that we get into. And that's the difference between, for example, the 12 tet scale we use versus a 5 tet scale they use in the Pacific Islands.
I'm curious if you are, this is not, I mean, I am curious, but well, I'm really reflecting a question from the audience, not just my curiosity. But do you have any information? Do other species hear dissonance the way humans hear dissonance, or do we have any idea what other species regard as pleasing or dissonant?
That actually I have no experience with. Certainly other species have different ranges of hearing. I think that's well known, but I personally do not have any experience with that. It's the kind of question that if my students ask in the class, I'd get to give my favorite answer, which is, I'm not really sure, but that's a really interesting idea for a course project. Students have to do 2 projects in the class, and they pretty much can pick anything they want and tie it back to the topics in the class. And that's exactly what I'd say in that incident. I've learned so much from the course projects.
Sounds like you're a great teacher. I am on that line. There was a question: is the class you teach available to it says to other UC students, but let's just ask who is able to take the class that you teach?
Anybody can take it. It is a discovery class, so it's taught at a lower level. It's not a rigorous mathematical level. We're trying to introduce students to science. Students who are music majors, history majors have to satisfy a breadth requirement, take a science class. So this is one that hopefully they can take and maybe learn something without being intimidated by the science. But now we're back to, again, the course projects. A music major will say, I'm really interested in the different timbre between the nylon strings and the steel strings on my guitar. A data science major will say, I'm interested in downloading Spotify and looking at the catalog and what people are preferring in terms of music. So it's all majors across the board. I've had STEM majors as well as liberal arts majors.
So I have, let's say, there's a question here that I don't know exactly what it means, but I'm thinking you probably do. The question is, can you explain the Wagner note in Tristan and Isolde? So I don't personally, I'm not an opera aficionado, so I don't know what that means, but perhaps you do.
Unfortunately, no, I'm not familiar with that. So
That's fine. I mean, we'll have to, somebody else will, maybe somebody in the chat window can answer it. And then I'll do one last question here, which is apparently there is a disorder that can delay the sound coming from one ear compared to the other ear. And what does that do to music perception if you have that particular disorder? And I suppose the speculation is, what do you think would happen if you had a delay between your 2 ears?
well, it is the case that we're able to localize sound in part by the shape of the pinna, which is this outer portion, which is what we hear, but also by when the sound comes in and that partial delay, if the sound is coming from your left, it reaches your ears at different times. So that delay under normal circumstances is what helps us localize where the sound is coming from. So I would imagine if somebody suffered from that disorder, they would have trouble localizing the sound. That would be my first inclination as to issues with it.
Well, great. Thank you. That was a thought-provoking talk, and I think we will move on. We'll have a few minutes at the very end for some more questions, so people can keep putting things in the chat window if they wish. We're going to now move on to our next speaker of the evening, Frédéric Theunissen. And Frédéric is a professor of integrative biology, psychology, and neuroscience here at UC Berkeley. He's well known internationally for his outstanding work in the field of behavioral neuroscience, particularly auditory physiology. He combines neurophysiology, acoustic analysis, and behavioral approaches to study the auditory system of humans and birds. His research has established that our brains possess specialized mechanisms for processing speech sounds, particularly in recognizing pitch changes that convey meaning and emotion. His work also hypothesized that a similar, perhaps specialized set of neurons exists for music, dedicated to predicting the sequence of notes in a melody, akin to how certain neurons predict speech sounds. So, Frédéric, please tell us about your work.
Thank you, Francis, for that introduction. So I'm first going to very briefly put on my birdsong researcher to answer previous questions about perception in other animals, to tell you that zebra finches actually have incredible sensitivity to inharmonicity that is supposedly superior than humans. So just a little, cocktail party story about zebra finches. I think we are all here because we are fascinated by music. And I think as an auditory scientist, music is the ultimate auditory experience. And why is that? It's because music is so rich, right? It has pitch, it has timbre, it has multiple voices that usually should make a cacophony that when you put them together make this amazing kind of immersive experience. And I'm going to play you some music by Renee Fleming, who sings vocalese from Rachmaninoff. And you've seen these pictures already because Terry has shown you. So these are spectrograms. It's a way to visualize the complexity of these sounds. So let's just start listening to this music. What you can see here in terms of the horizontal lines corresponds to the height of the notes. You could see that there's above the first line that you see, there's the overtones that gives you the timbre of the voice. The little wiggles are the vibrato that Renee is so good at doing. She can do a legato, where she's putting 2 or 3 notes together and you hear the shape go by. Here she's going to slow her vibrato. And we're going to get this tremolo, this changes in amplitude modulation. Amazing perception. How does our brain kind of mediate that and allows us to have that immersive experience? And it's something that, of course, in 10 minutes, I'm not going to be able to describe, but I'll take you through 2 steps. The first of all is the step that you already heard about, what's happening in terms of the auditory periphery at the cochlea. And what you'll see, what you already heard, is that the cochlea does a frequency filter analysis. It's a frequency filter bank, and it decomposes the sounds into frequencies. And this is useful as a representation, but is very far from the perception that we have in terms of the pitch and the timbre of sounds. And so this is going to have to be then resynthesized. We go from this analysis stage at the periphery to resynthesis that's going to happen. I'm going to skip a lot of the steps that are happening in the auditory midbrain and the auditory thalamus, and just tell you a little bit about, how we're going from the cochlea that's doing this analysis to the auditory cortex that is doing the synthesis. So, as you heard in the previous talk, the cochlea is decomposing the sound into frequencies. At the base of the cochlea, it is narrow and stiff, and it absorbs the high frequencies. So here is again Renee singing vocalese. So we've heard that song. And if you listen, if you're a neuron that is transducing the energy that is right here at the beginning of the cochlea, this is what that neuron is listening to. So I hope that some of you can hear that high frequency 9 kilohertz. And then the sound keeps on traveling down the basilar membrane here in the cochlea. This is what's left. So for those of you who've lost all your hearing above 9 kilohertz, those 2 sounds should sound exactly the same because we've only filtered sounds that you can't hear. Then you're close to the middle of the cochlea. This is what is absorbed. So this is a neuron in the 2 kilohertz zone that is listening to those sounds. And then later, further down the cochlea, here's a 300 hertz channel. And that is the sound. So this is the frequency analysis. I think what you should be left with is that, okay, that decomposition is great in terms of looking at what's happening at different frequencies, but it's actually pulling me further away from my percept of this kind of musical sense that is so complex and that has all these elements together. So now I need to put it back together. And so this is where we're going to go into the cortex and try to understand what is the representation level of the auditory cortex that allows us to do that synthesis, putting the information back together. And the way we think about the auditory cortex is as a modulation filter bank. And what do we mean by a modulation filter bank? So if you look again at a spectrogram, this kind of time frequency picture of the sound, in this case of speech, you see that there's structure in time. So you want to be able to kind of put together things that happen at different points in time. This will give you the percepts of rhythm, but also of time. We call those temporal modulations. You want to be sensitive to temporal modulations. Similarly, if you look across frequencies, you want to be sensitive to the structure across frequencies. We speak of those as spectral modulations, and these spectral modulations will give you the percept of pitch, but also of timbre. And then there's things together, the joint spectral-temporal modulation that will give you percepts such as the vibrato that you heard in René's voice. And so a modulation filter is basically, again, a decomposition or representation of these structures, but not according to frequencies, but according to the spectral and temporal modulations. And what is shown here in the picture on the right is that if you look at specific temporal modulations and spectral modulations, they will correspond to different percepts that we have, the primary percepts that we have in audition, the rhythm, the timbre, and the pitch. What we know is that both in animals and in the human auditory cortex, that we have different filters that are sensitive to different aspects of these spectral and temporal modulations. And so what I can do to make this kind of, to give you a sense of what this modulation filter bank is doing is to play you some of the sounds through these different types of filters that you find at the level of the auditory cortex. So we can find a filter that is mostly focusing on the timbre, and this is what René's Fleming voice would sound through that filter. So you could really hear the quality of the sound, but you've lost some of the melody, some of the pitch. Or now we can do the opposite and try to focus on the spectral modulations that are really important for us to get the percept of pitch. And what you'll hear is that you're really going to have a good sense of the notes, but the quality of the sound is going to be gone away because you're not going to have any of the timbre. So it's going to sound, very dry. Kind of flat sound. So that's just to give you a this is a picture. So sorry, let me just up that. The pictures of what the spectrogram would look like if you listen to the sounds through these channels. And so this is what we believe that the auditory cortex is doing. It's going to represent the sounds in terms of the spectral temporal modulations and give us, be able to mediate basically these different percepts. Okay, but there's a lot more to music than just timbre and pitch, right? Music has this connective aspect of it. Where we have expectations about the melody, and it has an emotional component as well that is so important in terms of humans expressing their emotions through music. And I'm just going to tell you something about the more cognitive aspect of it, which is the kind of expectations that we have in music. And so if I just play you the beginning notes of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven. Oh. Huh. Okay, my video is not playing. I can just, make it for you. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. You know what to expect, right? There's some sort of rules, and you know what's coming. What we were interested in doing, and this is work that I did with Neuroscience and Kahn, who was a postdoc at Ed Chang's lab at UCSF, is to look at representation in the auditory cortex of humans, not only of pitch and pitch changes, but also of expectation. And what we found was I think quite surprising is that if you look at the diagram here, that you have some areas of the primary auditory cortex that are sensitive to pitch, shown here in orange, some other ones that are sensitive to pitch change, but then there's a whole set here towards the back of your auditory cortex that were really sensitive to expectations. So you could predict the responses of these cortical areas if you played music that either was following your expectations or violated musical expectations. And was also unique about these brain regions is that they were sensitive to music. So the only neurons here, or the only cortical areas that were really music selective are the green areas, because in other sounds, there's pitch and there's pitch change, but only in music did we really have rules about the expectations of this kind of musical sense. And so we found, music sensitive areas, and there were also some areas that were speech sensitive, and the speech sensitive areas were areas that were sensitive to expectations about speech. So instead of expectations about melody, expectations about phonemes. And so this is a way to kind of understand what is specialized, what part of your brain is specialized for speech versus music. And I'll stop there. I think, in the small amount of time I had, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the computations that are happening in the auditory system that allow us to kind of perceive music and perceive, in particular, rhythm, timbre, and pitch. But that music is, of course, a lot more than that, and there's a lot more to discover in terms of the cognitive aspects and the emotional aspects, which I just briefly touched on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There we go. So I'm going to ask you a question. You talked about memory interacting with music versus speech, and I wondered if you want to make any comments about that. How do they interact differently? I think we've heard that it is easier to remember music than it is to remember speech. So, what can you offer any thoughts on that?
Boy, I mean, what I was talking, it was more about, expectations, right? So in terms of instantaneous expectations and not long-term memories. So, if you hear somebody say, it's cold, I'm going to put my you thinking jacket, right? You're having that expectation. That's kind of a phonemic expectation. So clearly it involves the memory, your semantic memory of the words. Similarly, for music, you have certain expectations about what is going to be the next chord in a succession of chords. In terms of memories, and I think Bob Knight is going to be able to maybe add some comments to that, because he's actually done some work and looked at the role of the hippocampus, which is part of the brain that is really involved in memories and episodic memories. I think one of the things that is maybe surprising with music is that the memory, the musical memory, might be more distributed than memories for other things. And I'll just kind of leave it at that. So.
Interesting. Yeah. And actually that question will lead me directly into the next question from an audience member, which is that you spoke of the expectations. How much of that expectation is from having heard the tune before, from, therefore from memory, versus an expectation based on just, more of a sense that after you hear the tonic note, you should hear a third, or if you hear a third note, you should then hear the tonic.
Right. I think this is very plastic, and it's because of your experience. So just like we have expectations in language because we've learned to speak English, we have expectations in music because we've heard music. Even if you're not a musician, you're going to have very strong expectations in terms of that sense. So I think at the level of the cortex, I would say it's mostly all learned and cultural. And whether there's some more, kind of innate kind of expectations, I think they're going to be more related to what we heard in the first talk about sounds being, having some dissonance or not having dissonance.
Great. So the next question. So humans, of course, make music and they evoke emotions. We all have that experience that that they evoke emotions that are sort of tied directly to memories in a lot of ways. And now I'm inserting a little bit of my own thoughts on that topic. Yeah. So I should not do that. I should just leave the question. The question is, are there examples of naturally occurring sounds that evoke emotion, just the same way that music does?
You mean like innately?
Yes, I think
so,
think
So,
I mean, I shouldn't speak for the
yeah,
audience member, but I will
yeah,
interpret it as just like innately, like
right.
it sounds like, I mean, I could imagine, for example, ocean waves or something like that.
Right.
How
Okay.
interpretable.
So there's this idea of universality of emotions that are represented in sounds. Just like you might have, pictures that are soft versus pictures that are spiky. There are sounds that are more appeasing, which tend to be lower frequency and tonal sounds, and sounds that are less appeasing. And this is true across the animal kingdom. So animals, if you look at the alarm calls that are used by animals, they tend to be short, high frequency. They're dissonant if they're starting to become, if you're going into kind of the more anxious range. Whereas appeasing sounds tend to be lower frequency and longer and more tonal. And so those are kind of universals, I would say, kind of a universal language that all animals use. In terms of memory, I think as I said, when you have a sensory experience that's so rich like music, I think it's easy to associate it with other events in your life, right? It's a big part of an event, right? If you have an event and you want to make a memory of that, you're putting that event into memory. Music is such a big part of that event that it's a strong part of that memory, if that makes sense.
It does. It makes a great deal of sense. So an interesting question. If a song, which typically it does, has both music and lyrics, so are they processed differently, or are the expectations can there be different expectations for the notes versus the lyrics of a song, let's say?
I would say yes. So you would combine both, right? I mean, you would invoke both your speech modules to kind of have expectations about what the speech is going to say, what the voice is going to say in the story, and then you're going to have music expectations. Professor Knight is going to talk after about differences between spoken and singing voices, and so I think you'll have some interesting stories there to follow.
Yeah, and just for the audience to know, I'm skipping some questions because I think they will come up better after the next talk.
Right.
And so
right.
I'm not, I'm skipping
Right.
a little bit of these questions. An interesting topic about learning music from an early age, if that affects the ability, the specific question is, does it affect the ability to learn new languages? But one could generalize perhaps to say, if you learn music at a very early age, does that affect your ability to learn language in general, but also to learn music, perhaps?
Does it I think early experience, and this goes, I think it's going to go across music and speech, right? There's, is early experience is going to affect kind of your later abilities and your later experience. And this is true. If the person is interested in kind of experiences, what is early experience in terms of music, there's some really incredible research that people have done now using the internet in terms of testing, thousands of people that have different types of musical experience and as well as, cultural experience and language experiences. Just to point out, kind of one of these studies, they were comparing people that learn tonal languages versus non-tonal languages. And indeed, people that learn tonal languages are slightly better at pitch discrimination in terms of music, even if you control for them being musicians. But interestingly enough, they're a little worse at rhythm discrimination. So this is one of these things where your early experience has affected your musical sense or your musical abilities in these kind of opposing ways.
So we definitely need to move on, but I have a very short question, which I just can't resist asking. Do we know if plants can have a hearing function? Can plants hear?
I think plants can sense vibrations, and they have mechanoreceptors on their leaves, and this is well known. And so in that sense, I think they can be sensitive to sounds.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, as before, I will note that there will be another chance at the end to address some more of these questions. And I think the next topic from Professor Knight is going to play well with this. And some of the questions that have been asked and not that have been asked by the audience will be answered in this upcoming talk. So I will move on. So thank you again, Frédéric. That was a fascinating talk. We will now move on to our final speaker this evening, which is Professor of Neuroscience and Psychology, Bob Knight. So Bob has received numerous scientific awards and recognition for his research into the contribution of the prefrontal cortex to human behavior, and specifically has worked on the neural basis of music representation in the human brain. His work in recording and translating brainwaves to capture the musical elements of speech recently made headlines when his team reconstructed snippets of Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall from brainwaves. So Bob is embarking on new research to understand the brain circuits that allow some people with aphasia due to stroke or brain damage to communicate by singing when they cannot otherwise find the words to express themselves. So Bob, thank you for joining us, and go ahead and share some insight with us.
Thank you, Francis. Okay, so I'm going to first present to you an over 100-year-old clinical phenomena, which is that patients with aphasia, which is usually damage to the left hemisphere and they have trouble speaking, can often sing. Not all of them, a small minority. And the question is, can we figure out what's the neurophysiology of singing? And I'm going to show you a patient who can do this. And by the way, when you see a patient tape, it means the patient has consented for their use for teaching. A very nice couple. This gentleman has a very severe output aphasia. Try this, okay? Do you have grandchildren?
No, I have near.
Not nearby.
Yeah, not nearby.
Yeah.
Not nearby.
Yeah.
So you must have been. Let's try Happy Birthday. Okay, ready? With me, ready?
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Stephen.
He's one of your research subjects. He can sing, right?
Yeah.
This is an old. He basically can sing, and he has now say the words.
No, that chance. Happy birthday to.
There's your signature patient.
Yeah.
So why is that? And it's always been felt that the singing ability, like Happy Birthday, is overlearned since you've heard it a zillion times. But you'll see in this one little snippet, it's not true. He's a gourmet cook and he can't order food.
The ataxia was so much better.
Seeing in the meat counter. And the seafood.
You should sing at the meat counter. Yeah.
Why don't you try that? I like some sausage. How about a pork loin? Like, can I hear you sing? I like
some swordfish.
Wow.
So there you go. So you've seen it, and now what is going on? If we could unlock the physiology of that, maybe we could come up with interventions that could help patients. And there's over 500,000 people in this country with epilepsy. I'm sorry, 500,000 people with aphasia. So how we get at this is that patients with epilepsy, and there's about 3.5 million in the country, about 20% don't respond to medication. So some of them we can bring into the hospital and implant electrodes on their brain, either on the surface of the brain or in depth of the brain. And we have auditory coverage and very extensive coverage. They're in the hospital waiting to have a seizure. If we can identify it, then we can surgically extirpate and get a very good control now of their seizures. And this was first introduced in 1977 by the French neurosurgeons Banco and Talleyrand. And they're very French because this is an interesting picture of the first case. The patient gets to take a smoking break in the operating room. I don't think we do that in the US. So we have data from these patients. And the first thing we did was try to develop a neural prosthetic device for people who can't speak. What we did is we took patients and they had electrodes over auditory regions. We presented them with sound waves. We recorded their electrical activity. And then we took each electrode and tried to, using machine learning, assign it a specific frequency or combination of frequencies and reconstruct the sound. That's the first step. So here's what it sounds like. What we're trying to do is read the notes of the cortex. So think of it this way. You're a musician. You can play the piano very well. You see someone playing the piano, but the sound's off. You can figure out what they're playing because you know what each key represents. That's what we're trying to do, is read the notes of the cortex. So you'll see the first success in this was many years ago. It was about 10 or 12 years ago. You're going to hear the word the patient heard. There's 4 words. And then the word that we were able to reconstruct from direct brain recording.
Waldo? Structure. Doubt. Property.
And it's only gotten better with improvements in machine learning and various techniques. So this was very exciting. These patients can also, we can reconstruct when they imagine a word, and that's very key to develop a prosthetic device. So what about music? And everybody knows this song. Just a brick in the wall. It's of course not the right album cover, but it does have a spectrogram. That's from the moon. So these patients, while they're in there doing various studies, we also had them listen to songs. And this was another set of data we recorded a long time ago. This is 29 patients, a whole bunch of electrodes. Most of the electrodes were about 1 centimeter apart. And if they were, so what you're going to hear in terms of our reconstruction ability is a little coarse. If the electrodes had been 1 millimeter apart, which is what we're going for now, it would sound much better. We did the same thing we did with the speech. We recorded their electrical activity and then trying to assign different electrodes either to 1 or 2 or even 3 frequencies, basically could we reconstruct the sound? So here you go. Here is the original Pink Floyd, the spectrogram, as you've seen from Terry and Frédéric, beautifully shown. The reconstructed song, you can see it looks like it. It's not quite as good. And I want you to notice here that the best reconstruction, the best contributor to the reconstruction was the right hemisphere, particularly the right temporal and posterior frontal regions. And keep that in mind because remember, language is on the left side. And could it be that the singing ability is being supported by right hemisphere function? So here's the original song.
All it was just a brick in the wall.
And here's the reconstructed song. You can see the spectrograms look good. It's a little murky. It almost sounds like they're playing from underwater, but in part that's due to because we didn't have finer electrodes back in 2010. By the way, why do we do it now? Why did we wait so long to do it? Because we just had the data sitting there, and I had a postdoc from France who played in a rock band in college, and I asked him if he wanted to take a look at the data, and he did. So you heard the original song. Here's Pink Floyd being reconstructed directly from human brain recordings. Not perfect, a little muddy, but it will only get better with better electrodes. So you can reconstruct words, you can reconstruct song, and it's based on the principles that you heard presented by Terry and Frédéric. You're basically assigning frequency to electrodes, use machine learning, and crack the code. Now, back to that patient and back to the numerous patients with aphasia. What's going on? So this is data from a senior grad student, Alexis Bakar, in psychology. And she did she's done some beautiful studies recording from patients with electrodes inserted in their head. And this is recent data. And they had to do several things, but I'll just show you one. They either had to speak a sentence, and this is her speaking the sentence.
Catching crawfish is a challenge.
Or sing a sentence.
Catching crawfish is a challenge.
So there you go. So she's run this in a cohort of almost now 20 patients. She's gotten data from the brain. What's going on? What might give us a hint at what is this amazing ability to sing when you can't speak? here's the recordings, and these are left hemisphere recordings recording direct electrical activity from the human brain. That's the right hemisphere. And this is just a top-down view in the middle. And what you can see, not so surprisingly, well-known, the classic left hemisphere language areas in the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and in the premotor area. Not much activity in the right hemisphere. This is for speaking. Here's the same patient now singing the same exact phrase or sentence. And I think you can see quite clearly that, yes, the left hemisphere doesn't go away. It's not like completely flipped like in language. It's quite active, but there's very robust right hemisphere activity in these classic motor and temporal lobe regions. And we're very excited about this because this is a potential target for the extracranial stimulation, and perhaps we can help people who can't sing, and maybe even people who sing better, and maybe it'll improve their speaking. Now, that's all, to be determined. We're still doing the basic physiology. So I think in sum, music is amazing. Understanding it in making a speech prosthesis, you really would like to understand it, because you can then have a prosodic element of a speech prosthesis. So instead of saying, the patient saying from their brain recordings, "I love you," it's "I love you." And I'll stop there. And thank you very much for joining us on this symposium.
So thank you, Bob, very much. That was inspiring. And the first question from the audience is, you talked about aphasia, and is this similar to what people with Alzheimer's or dementia, who are still able to play songs from memory and learn to conduct and things like that? And do you know can you connect that?
Yeah, no, yeah, music can be, I was just talking to somebody about their loved one who had a bad brain tumor in the left hemisphere and had completely lost language. And then his friends would come over and they'd sing operas together. So the answer is yes. And it's not, most aphasic patients are from stroke, but you can get it from tumors. You can get it from certain degenerative disorders like frontal temporal dementia. Aphasia is just a symptom complex. It's not a cause, basically.
Next question. Is there a difference in the reconstruction if participants are more familiar with a song? And the questioner wonders if singing along in their heads or anticipating the song changes the brain regions that can contribute to this reconstruction.
Well, maybe that particular person was a reviewer of the paper, because that was a question we were asked. And we said, you know what, we don't know, because the data was collected more because we let the patients listen to any songs they want, and they just to be relaxed. And we never really got enough of their pre-musical experience or whether they heard the song. But most people, I would say, have heard Another Brick in the Wall. That's a great question.
Next question. Are the same places in the brain stimulated in different people?
Well, the same general areas, yes, they're activated across people. There can be, if it's interesting, the neural organization of your first language can be off by a centimeter or two in different brain regions of your second language. Let's say your primary language is English, and then you learn French. They might not be exactly overlap. I don't know whether that's true for music. We just don't have enough information, but certainly for language.
And the next question is this difference between speech and music, could it be related to the fact that infants hear singing before they hear speech?
Well, they certainly hear sing-song from their parents. I don't know. I think it's a biological fact. I think we're genetically prone to have 95% of right-handers have language in the left hemisphere. My gut feeling is probably 100% of people have musical ability in the right hemisphere. I think it's evolved as a very, music is probably in many cultures evolutionarily more important even than language. It's a really powerful phenomenon. It was a question before. We did some studies where we played to Berkeley undergrads are really weird. I think it's a Boolin yard. It sounds like, and it turns out if we played you Happy Birthday and had one note off, this is per Frederickson prediction, one note off, basically your brain at 100 milliseconds says, whoops, that's wrong. So we played this very strange thing to undergrads for 30 minutes. They'd never heard it before. Then we played another piece of that music with one note off, and they had the same detection of the deviancy as deviance to Happy Birthday. That really tells you that these systems for rhythm extraction and prediction, they're basically universal.
Well, thank you very much. And unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for this evening. So we'll have to wrap it up at this point. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Terry. And these were interesting and enlightening presentations. And to close, I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Steve Kahn, who is the Dean of Mathematical and Physical Sciences and is a distinguished astrophysicist.
So thank you, Francis, and thanks again to all of our speakers for very compelling presentations. As we've learned, music is a major element of basic science research. It acts as a universal language that transcends disciplines, fostering collaboration and creativity among scientists. Music enriches our understanding of both the human condition and the scientific principles that govern the world, making it an integral part of the scientific narrative. In a time when entrepreneurship and application are highly valued, we cannot lose sight of the importance of basic science research. Basic science fosters critical thinking and problem-solving skills, encouraging a culture of curiosity and exploration. Basic science inquiry is essential for continuous progress, serving as the bedrock upon which applied sciences and technological advancements are built. I hope you'll join us again on Monday, November 18th, for the next installment of Basic Science Lights the Way. We will have 3 paleontologists who will discuss their research on the ancient flora and fauna of California and what secrets they can reveal about the place we call home. Please reach out if you'd like to learn more about anything we've covered. A video of today's presentation will be available at our Basic Science Lights the Way website. It'll be there approximately 2 weeks from now, and you can always visit the website to watch any episodes that you've missed in the past. Thanks for attending and showing such interest in this topic. Questions were great. We couldn't do our work without your interest, attention, and report. And so until next time, stay curious, fiat lux, and go Bears.